Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 508th episode of Constructed Criticism. I am your host, Masn, and my co-host, Abe Stein. Abe, how you doing?
I'm doing great, actually. The weather has been so rainy here in Maryland for like 2 weeks, and today it was, sunshine and warm. It was actually like spring, summertime. It was crazy.
That sounds nice. We have the release of the cicadas down here. Like, they're up.
That sounds great.
Well, they're constantly doing their thing. So if you like that, it's pretty good. I was talking to someone earlier today about how cicadas should evolve to survive longer, Because they kind of just like pop out, they pop their kid in the ground, and they die, Just like work a little harder.
You may try to live another way.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying your way's bad. I'm just saying try iterating, always improving. That is the main point of the show. And we are going to hop right into that. Spencer is gone this week. He is not feeling so well. But always improving is the main point of the show. And Abe, how have you been always improving this week?
Yeah, so my always improving this week comes from some of the stuff I've been doing to prepare for the RC in Dallas. Not to foreshadow what we're going to talk about in this episode or anything, but specifically, it's been kind of reckoning with like the amount of time and really being realistic with the amount of time I have to devote to testing for this event and what that means in terms of what decks I can reasonably consider. And Mason, you know this because I kind of came to you in a moment of crisis about the standard format in my time spent trying to get some reps in with the Slogurk deck, like the 4 or 5 color Legends deck that has been doing really well, and obviously put 2 players in the top 8 of the Pro Tour. And it's a bit technical, but I was playing this deck online, and I realized like within my first 5 or 10 matches that like there was a lot going on and a lot that was kind of unintuitive and hard to work in playing it online, that it was going to become very cumbersome and very time consuming to put effort into the deck, and that's not going to like make sense for me to spend the time on. And so rather than doing what I might have done in the past or might have done in other circumstances of just like kind of being really stubborn about it, fighting with Moto and, timing out a bunch of times and really trying to find ways to like grapple with this, I've decided to just use my time in more productive ways and decide to like, as much as I think Slogurk is a good choice for the tournament, if you have the experience and the time playing it, that's not going to be me. And that's okay. And finding like a way around that rather than kind of feeling stuck in the idea of like, okay, I think this is the deck that I should play, or this is like one of the best decks and I should just learn it, but thinking about it another way to have success and using my time better to achieve that.
Yeah, I think that can be something that a lot of people struggle with, right? It's like the time management and like wanting to be able to put in more than you can really give at the moment. And I think you're definitely not alone on that one.
Yeah, I do think that like there's a couple things maybe I could have done, or like I could have committed more time instead of like playing an RCQ over the weekend, like trying to get some people together and playing some in paper. Because I do think that most of the mechanics of the deck are easy to learn if there's not an interface working against you the whole time too. When you're able to shortcut a lot of things, even though it's a lot to keep track of, for those of you listening who might be thinking about like picking up Slogurk or have been putting in the time or feel intimidated by it, I don't want to like make it sound like it's an impossible task to learn the deck. I think it's not. I think that it's just that given my circumstances and how much of my testing has to be online, and I don't have time to like get together a group of people to jam or like, really spend a lot of time playing matches in paper. It is a lot to remember when you're actually doing the game actions, but it's more for me just the amount of time, like playing a bunch of full clock matches on Magic Online, trying to execute things that I think in paper would realistically be shortcuttable. It just means I'm spewing a lot of that time. So, if you're out there listening, don't get discouraged. If you have a group of people you play with regularly, or even just like a friend you can, hang out with and jam some games, and you're interested in playing Slogurk, like do that and see if it's for you. Don't just give up like I did, but it's also okay to say, this is not going to be the best thing for me. So I just want to make that was clear. But Mason, how did you always improve this week?
Yeah, my always improving moment this week really comes from trying hard to sort of bite my tongue. There have been a lot of interesting, like, sort of takes and opinions about some things that have been going on and about cards. And one thing that I think is, like, important is that, like, you can see something you disagree with somebody and just not interact, right? And, like, that's why I kind of, like, stumbled at the beginning there, because it's interesting where it's like, in a lot of ways, my always improving this week is like, hey, like, you don't have to, like, help some random person on the internet understand something, right? Like, even if, like, they're asking, right? Like, if it feels like they are being obtuse or they don't really want to learn, right? And they act like they do, but they don't really, you don't have to keep engaging. Like, if it seems like they want to, you put an effort and they're sort of bumping into it, you can just back off, right? Like, that's what I'm always improving of, like, not getting so, like, oh, I should help them and try and figure out the exact way to do it, because it's not my, like, well, it is my job, especially with Magic cards, but this person and, like, these people in these situations, that's not what's going on, and it's better just to, like, let things lie. And I think preview season has this come up a lot, and I think when you have strong sets like MH3 comes up a lot, and having, worked on it, I already have some things, and so I want to, like, my instinct is to try to help people understand when they're confused, but sometimes you just don't actually get anywhere, So that's my always improving, just, sort of live and let be.
Yeah, I think it's also, it can be really tough sometimes, just as, like, a person, to know that you're right about something or have a strong feeling that you're right about something, and have someone so strongly oppose that or, like, not understand what you believe to be, like, logically true, because of, like, could be a gap in understanding, it could be a million things, it could be just, like, a different set of perspectives. But especially when it comes to Magic cards, time will tell what cards out of Modern Horizons 3 are broken or not broken or playable or unplayable. People will start playing them and win with them, or they will not and they won't,
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
so
I think there's also
it's okay to pick your battles in that way, and that's a very, very good skill to have, especially, like, when it comes to things that aren't the most important things in life, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, the preview season for Modern Horizons 3, not the time to really, feel like you have to rip your hair out proving to someone or explaining to someone that you're right about something.
Well, I think it's not even right a lot in these situations, right? Because, like, for one, I think if I know exactly where cards land, that is probably pretty bad. And probably we did a bad job if I am right about all the cards, right? Like, that is, like, actively a failing of us in working on the set. It is much more like what the goals are and, like, what things are happening with certain cards, if that makes sense. Where it's like, oh,
right. I think I should maybe use a different word than right. Like, right, I think it can be interpreted a lot to mean, like, correct, right? Sure, like, there's a right or wrong. But, when I say, like, you're right, it's like, it means that you have, there's a well thought out reasoning behind things, and, like, you've come to a logical conclusion about why something is, right? When it comes to something like a card design, for you, I'm sure, having worked on the set, there was a lot of time and a lot of thought and a lot of discussion that went into the exact text of a card being the way it is. I don't think any card in Modern Horizons 3 got printed as it was, just kind of, by accident with a bunch of shrugs and no talk. That would be really, really strange to me. So, yeah, not to say that, like, proving to someone you're right in the sense that, like, what they're saying is not looking at the whole picture, right? That you have a more informed perspective.
Yeah, I guess maybe the way I should have said this, which would have saved us a bunch of time, is, like, they don't need to understand what the goal is. Like, that's fine. You know what I mean? Like, at the end of the day, the card is their card, and, like, some people love to be, like, armchair game designers and see all these sort of things, and that's fine, But, like, these are sort of the goals, and those are the goals. And you could say they are different, but they weren't. And if you want to believe that to be true, that's fine, because it doesn't really matter. But it's like, they are what they are, So it's interesting. Anyways, that's enough about that. We'll be talking plenty about Modern Horizons 2 in about 2 weeks when we do our Pick 2 set review. I am very excited about that. I've gotten the word, Abe. I can just talk about the cards I think are strong, too. During our Pick 2, sometimes we get, like, the hits, and there was some worry, like, I shouldn't talk about that for various reasons, but I've been given the thumbs up. So,
oh, wow. So you can explain to Spencer and I why we're wrong.
Well, I can just tell you why I think some cards are strong, So, but I'm going to keep all that to myself until, we hit that portion of things. But that's exciting, Originally, I was just going to tell more stories during the favorites, but here we are now. Anyways, enough about that. We have a little bit of housekeeping. That is shouting out our sponsor, Heavy Play. you can go to Heavy Play LLC and use code CCMTG10 at checkout in order to help support the show and get 10% off all of the Heavy Play products. There are some new things coming out very soon, so keep an eye glued to the website. And if you're someone who has been interested in Heavy Play or you're wanting to get it, make sure to use somebody's creator code, if not ours, somebody else. It really helps support us when you do it. That lets them know that, you're like engaging with this and it's worth everyone's time and effort. We love Heavy Play and we're glad to have them sponsor us. But I just wanted to let y'all know that, if you're going to make a purchase, do not forget to use somebody's code. But
yeah, honestly, listeners, if you're buying anything and you get to a screen that says put in a discount code, just try CCMTG. Just try it.
yeah.
Amazon. You're on Amazon, CCMTG. Why not? You're on you're on Instacart checking out CCMTG. Why not? You never know when those deals could be coming down the pipeline. Could book. You never know when they ask, why are so many people putting in CCMTG when they check out when there's no code for that? Maybe they'll reach out.
True. Very true. You can also support the show by going to patreon.com/ccmtg. Becoming a patron of the show, you get Discord access. There's a lot of people working on stuff, a lot of conversation during previews and decks. For the RC people, talk a little bit about that stuff. So if you're looking for like-minded players who are going to always improve, that's a great place to go. The show will always be free. That's a great way to give back. Speaking of giving back, Abe, one of the things that we do for everyone, not just patrons, but I think we do try to send these out to patrons every now and again, is the wristbands. And I went out to Philadelphia to shoot a episode of the Scry Babies and Go on their podcast this past weekend. And, I was looking in my bag and I had some of the misprinted wristbands on me. And they're like, ooh, we want some. And so I give them to Steve and Tori, and they were wearing it all day. And we go to see Fall Guy, a very good movie for what it's worth. If you want to go see it in theaters, I'll give it the recommendation.
Based on the video game?
Yeah, honestly, that's what I said. When we were walking in, I started walking like a Fall Guy, and I was like, get it? Like the movie, but anyways, no, it's really good. But they had their wristbands on. I totally forget these things glow in the dark. Right. And so the lights start dimming and I just hear Steve go, whoa. He's like, it glows. And it was so funny because we're also the only people in the theater. And it was just a good time. So if you ever want to get one of those, I always keep some in my bag. Yeah, as is Abe and Spencer as well. So you can grab one of those in an event. But you can also become a patron and we'll get some sent out to you in time. That's just one of those things where it's you get to be there for a little bit and we need to get a new shipment of those, which we have coming. So thank you so much for all the support. And let's hop into our main topic, which is RC Prep, Abe. RC Dallas is about 2 weeks from today. It's a little bit less technically. But, on the 31st, that is when deck lists are due of May for the USRC. And we've gotten some previous results going into this. So it's one of the RCs, the US has had a couple RCs where it's release weekend sets, right? We had Brothers War, and I believe the last fall set as well. But regardless, we've had a couple of those, but this time we actually have a lot of information between Canadian RCs, the Pro Tour, etc. So where do you feel the format is at given those previous results?
I wish this were an easy question to answer. That's where I feel the format's at. You know what I mean? There is so much going on in Standard right now. So many archetypes are really viable. So many card choices matter. But I'd say currently, really coming out of the Pro Tour and then also the Canadian Regional Championships, you'd think based on after the Pro Tour, Domain, a completely dominant performance by Domain in that tournament. Domain, I would not say, is the number one deck in the format right now. I think enough of the format is doing things that are respecting Domain's big game to kind of make that not the primo. I'd say, and I mean, even I think the Goldfish data reflects this, is that the blue-white control deck and the analyst decks are the two top dogs of the Standard format as it stands. Because they're so good against such a breadth of form, they're so powerful on their own. And then below that, and when I say below that, I mean by maybe just a smidge. Other decks in its power band are just about everything that we'll probably talk about today. There are so many playable decks that all attack the format from different angles and force people to be building their deck to respect it, that it is just hard to say what the best thing is, and that's really exciting.
Yeah, it's definitely not where we kind of thought things would be, right? Like, normally if you have a Pro Tour and this many, like, other big events, and Magic Online's increased its number of challenges dramatically, right? So we're getting, like, more data than ever. Typically, it would be like, we're going to kind of know, like, the one or two best decks, and then, like, the clear step down, and, like, the thing you can maybe pull the trigger on to get, you know, take a bit of a chance, but could pay off really big, right? Like, standard formats typically are not this healthy. This is, like, actually just a beautiful accident, right? Like, they did not test with the four of the sets, in the format. It worked out to be, you know, very fun and very dynamic. And we just have no clue what, you know, the true best deck is going into any weekend, right? We have ideas. There are decks that we think could be the best at any given time, but there is just, you know, always something going on, and the decks have the tools to adapt to one another. So it's really interesting. I do think, you know, they're like, sort of kick things off as we generally talk about the format here. Starting with Domain is good because it did win the Pro Tour, and Abe, I think for some amount of players, that's like enough to just sort of like lock it in early. And Domain is strong enough that even with people respecting it, I think you're still going to see probably a bit more Domain than you realistically should. I think we've been seeing that from the last couple of events, and the Domain deck is really powerful. And maybe we should even give that caveat that, you know, we plan to talk about 7 or 8 decks today on this list, and I think, you know, maybe with one exception or two exceptions, depending on who you ask, we all think they are within the same power band, right? Like you mentioned before, they are all about the same level, and it really is sort of almost like reading tea leaves on which one's going to be the best on the weekend.
Yeah, so, I mean, what is there that you want to say about Domain that hasn't been said already? Like, I feel like when, like, after, in the Pro Tour retrospective, right, Ikawa's deck was really, really well built for that field, and you know, completely dominated it. It was right. It didn't drop a match of standard all the way through the whole tournament. Right, 7-0, didn't have to play anymore in the Swiss, and then won the whole Pro Tour. What do you think has been kind of the response from other decks, and what do you think has changed in the way that this deck being built has made sense or not made sense from that list? Like, what do you feel about like Domain's positioning, and you know, is it something where they need to do something to adapt? Is it that the metagame percentages and like their kind of natural predators is increasing? What do you think is going on with Domain?
Yeah, I think there's some kind of increase in natural predators that's occurring. We saw some people playing more Toxic recently, and that's like a deck that, you know, historically crushes Domain. I think also Domain can be built in lots of various ways because, you know, it is 5 colors, but it's interesting because it's very rigid in those things, right? Like, it kind of needs certain types of stuff. So while there are lots of options that we've seen, you know, various Domain decks try, they are kind of locked into playing very similar things. So I think Domain structurally would need to be almost like a different deck, I think, to really rise above. But I think what Domain benefits the most from is when people don't respect it enough, right? Like, I think going into the Pro Tour, some people gave Domain a decent amount of respect, but with that, like, really strong build and game plan and not enough, it sort of got to run over people. And I think people are going to continue to respect Domain a decent amount, but that might end up changing. You know, obviously, we are doing this like 2 weeks early, which also, comment on YouTube, tweet at us, let us know. We tried doing this episode a bit early so that you would have more time to have more information to process, right? When these episodes normally come out, every show does them the week of the RC. Become very hard to listen to, so we try to space ours out from everyone else's and give you a bit more time to adapt. So if you like this, let us know. Anyways, I think, you know, there's a little bit of time. I think Domain could do some things, like to become lower to the ground and still have that strong top end, but ultimately I think you're giving up too much of what makes the deck strong. And so I think if you're playing Domain, you're kind of hoping that people continue to disrespect you, don't really play cards that splash hate you, I should say. And then, you know, you're kind of hoping to overpower people because your core game plan, when it goes off, is incredibly powerful.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's worth talking about also, like, what were the metagame factors of the Pro Tour that kind of allowed Domain to have that level of not being as respected. And that's really, you know, the deck to beat coming into the Pro Tour was Esper. Everyone was talking about Esper. Like Rafine, Bat, etc. Like, all of that was the heart of, okay, this is like the deck to beat, and it was the deck that's most played. And in the whole format, especially the decks that were really successful, the whole format was really letting those decks take down the decks that were, strong and proactive and able to get under a deck like Domain. And Domain really capitalized on that by letting all of those matchups be taken care of by these mid-range decks and by the Esper decks, and kind of get a walk all the way through by having such a low chance of playing against a lot of its natural predators. And since then, what I think has happened is that Esper being as played as it was, and people getting to see decks that did have good plans against beating Esper succeed, has made it so that Esper has been on the decline. I don't know if you felt the same thing in your testing or your experience with the format right now, Mason, but it feels like people are playing a lot less Esper than they were even just before the Canadian RC. Like, people kind of started talking about Esper's not all that. It's not the deck that, many players thought it was in terms of just being the best thing to play. And that has kind of given more breathing room to these things that are kind of attacking Domain from either angle. Because, Esper's really good at dealing with big portions of the metagame, but is pretty exploitable by some of the things going on. And there are ways to go over it, or ways to really not care about what it's doing, and beat those disruptive elements of it, and their kind of one-note game plan of playing creatures and disrupting. But that's kind of paved the way for the format to be in kind of the state that it's in now, is getting shaken up from this place of, okay, well, Esper is the default. This deck is good against all the things that I know are strong, to, Domain is still a deck you have to worry about, right? Esper's not everything, and Esper's not necessarily the best choice to make, given that things like Domain are around. So what are the decks that beat that? And it's really caused that churn. So I think it's important to acknowledge where we came from. I don't know if you want to stop and talk about Esper at all, or some of these other decks, but I think that when you think about that, because a lot of what's going to come down to 11 days from recording today, when it comes time for deck lists to be due, is what do you think people are going to play, and what do you think the metagame is going to look like, and what are the cards and decks that people are going to be bringing the most of that you're going to have to be worried about. And I think that what made Domain so successful is that Ikawa successfully identified that a lot of the things that were going to beat Domain and people knew could beat Domain but had completely fallen off the map were not going to be there. They'd fallen off the map, and now we're starting to see those come back. And what are the things that get to come back in a world where Domain is respected and Esper's kind of dwindling, and all these questions, and the answers to those are really hard to figure out. So I don't know if you have anything you want to say else you say before we move on from Domain or
I don't have much to say about Domain. I will say, talking about Esper, I think one of the interesting things about it is people have just given up on blue-black, it seems, despite theoretically, I think blue-black looks pretty good into blue-white and Analyst and Domain. I think it does struggle with things like Convoke, Gurk, but I don't think it's the worst in the world against Gurk. So it's just interesting, because I do think Rafine is really, really good. But I also think you could play what we called legally Esper before, right? A blue-black deck playing Rafine. And with Concealed Courtyard, that's a much more doable thing when it comes to your mana. So I think Esper is a good deck. I like Esper. It is not my number one choice, but I think if you have a well-built Esper deck for the weekend, it can do very well. And you just have to sort of you were saying, Abe, with the success of Domain, it is a lot about understanding what's going to be going on and having the right tools. And I think Esper could be built to do that very easily, but you need to be on top of things, and you need to play well over the day, which can be very tough. Rafine, we talk about connive, Rafine forgives all sins, but it is hard to connive 3 or 4, and it's hard to do that over multiple rounds, over multiple days. So I think Esper is good, but I think you need to be willing to mix things up, and there are no sacred cows in the deck, is my opinion.
Yeah, I think that, I like what you were saying about Dimir in terms of how it seems like it should be positioned. I do think that there's a real cost to making, I think Rafine is a lot better than Gix in the current format, because you need to close games. Mm-hmm. Especially into, right, we just talked about Domain. I think that blue-black against Domain without something like Rafine to actually put pressure on the opponent and make sure that you really are drawing the right pieces of your deck. You get to see so many more cards with a Rafine than a Gix on average. Mm-hmm. And you get to deal more damage along the way. I think it's like really important to understand the difference between those two cards and why you might be drawn to that. But you're right, the mana has gotten better for quote unquote legally Esper to do that, and I do think that the blue and black interaction is really well positioned against the kind of slower sides of the format. How do you feel about those decks lining up against Analyst?
Yeah, so I mean, I Analyst, not to jump the shark here, it's my pick for the deck that I would play. I think that like the deck is very strong and does a good job of being able to adapt to most everything that's going on, and it does have flaws and things that you can attack about it. But I like Analyst's position against like Domain, because I think you just kind of go over the top of them. Yes, you can lose that matchup and they can have the right stuff for you and it can be challenging, but I think you can overpower them. And in blue-white, I think it's a lot about having the right pivot threat. So like we've seen Bonnie Paul, we've seen Tyrant Rex, these sort of cards that kind of like overpower you, but also I've seen players do things like try having a little extra negates, a couple extra Tashani Tidebinders is like a thing that they can bring in these matchups. So I think there's lots of different ways. I'm not exactly sure what the best way is. I have not been grinding Analyst enough to really know these things because I'm commentating the RC, so a lot more of my experience right now is like trying to understand all the decks so that I can talk about them, and also for coaching in this. So I haven't been like in the streets being like, what's every which way to Analyst, and like how do I figure that out? But I like it generally versus a lot of what's going on. I think the incidental life gain is really nice against the low to the ground decks like Convoke, and I think Esper falls into that a little bit too for what it's worth. Like Esper doesn't chunk you a ton at first, so gaining 3-4 life in those early turns can buy you a whole turn pretty easily. So I generally like it. I don't know how you feel about it too much currently, but I think it's like pretty well positioned and does a good job of just going way over the top of people.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Analyst... I mean, I opened on saying, like, I think Blue, White, and Analyst are two of the strongest decks in the format. Like, I think that they're really, really consistent in what they do, and they're trying to do something really powerful. They both are leveraging Memory Deluge, which is one of the best spells in Standard. And beyond that, I think that, like you said, the instant life gain that's in the Analyst deck of the, just the gain lands coming into play over and over again does a ton against kind of the clocks of the mid-range decks. I know I was just, before we were recording, playing around with one of the Golgari mid-range decks that one of the people I'm testing with has really liked, and I was giving that a spin to kind of check their work on what they've been working on so far. And like it was turn 5 or 6 or something, and I kind of been attacking him for, with a creature or two, like a Bronco and like a 3-power creature every turn or two, maybe getting a creature land in there when the mana worked out. And they were still just at like 10 life by the time they were casting things that I couldn't beat. So it was, and that was just based on the power of like them recurring a bunch of lands that gained them one. So that definitely does matter, and it does pose an interesting problem for the format that you unless you're a deck that's really hitting the gas and going fast. There's a lot of ways to gain a lot of instant life over the course of things. I know also like Domain has access to it as well. Menguchi had played a list of Domain with the Cornucopia that can gain a good amount of life over the course of a few turns and give that staying power against the mid-range deck. So you do really have to have a way to bust through as a mid-range deck in this format between the number of answers that there are from decks like Blue-White or Blue-Black Control or even Domain, and also the amount of instant life gain that there is in some of those decks as well.
Yeah, I think one thing too that some people I've heard are like really worried to play Analyst Abe in paper. They're like, I don't think I can do it. It's gonna be really clunky. It's gonna be hard. I just want to quickly say like, it does take some practice, but I do not think it is meaningfully different than playing Blue-White. Like your opponent's gonna take a lot of time. If you're proficient with things, it's going to be fine, and you just need to do a little bit of paper playing, and even just goldfishing, I think, will get the job done with Analyst. Like in your situation, for example, if I think you goldfishing, with some like paper cards and just being like, okay, this is what I would be doing, like I think that will help a lot and just will solve most of those issues about like being slow, etc.
Yeah, and I think too that the Analyst deck, like to your point about it not being much more difficult to play than Blue-White, like I think both decks are really big picture decks. Mm-hmm. Like I think that's part of the strength in such a wide open format with so many different decks that sets those two apart currently, is that in all matchups, these are decks that are already built to be thinking about the end game from the start. Like they're thinking about, okay, how is it that the game is going to end in my favor and what is it I'm trying to execute with the cards that I have. And if you're constantly thinking like that and your deck is built to be flexible like that, it means that in the games you're playing, right, you're going to be your deck is inherently more flexible because it's supposed to be able to be, right? Like, and I think Memory Deluge is a big part of that. Memory Deluge, you see a lot of your deck between even just casting a deluge and flashing back a deluge. You're seeing 11 cards.
A ton of your deck, yeah.
Yeah, which is right, a ton of your deck.
Yeah.
And that's not including that, like, an analyst between all of your, courtyards and hideouts and theaters and all these the search lands, like, your deck is becoming very thin by the time you're even like flashing back a deluge. So you're seeing a ton of the cards in your deck every game that you're playing, and that means that finding access to the cards that you need for a matchup or executing your game plan to be able to trump what your opponent is doing is that much more doable and that much better when you pull it off, and you're more able to adapt to playing against just who knows what it is you're going to sit down across from, right? All of your game ones, you're more likely to find the cards you're looking for, and your cards play, they play more roles and they're the broadest, right? Blue-white has a bunch of broad answers. It has a bunch of sweepers and counter spells and, the Wandering Emperor, and all those things are very broad. Teamer has its setup spells that are very strong, but it also has ill-timed explosion, and like I said, memory deluge, or ways to see more cards and just very inherently flexible cards in terms of its answers, and in some ways threats too. So all of that to say, it's kind of where I'm at in terms of the format right now with how open it is, and going into the RC. Something I'm keeping in mind is that whatever I'm playing, I want to make sure it's something that has broad coverage. Either that, or it's a very, very honed blade, right? Like getting caught in the middle of a deck that maybe has two plans, or is not to trying to execute on one thing, is pretty dangerous in terms of the plan. Like I've got to be either committed to being like, yep, I'm Convoke, or I'm Bant Toxic. I'm winning in this early game, and then if it gets beyond that, Like I'm super proactive, and that's my strength. There's not a lot of room to be just kind of like a halfway.
Do you want to talk a bit more about blue-white? Because I feel like we kind of talked about it, but we really didn't get into it.
Yeah, I mean, blue-white has continued to be the most played deck online. It continues to put up a lot of results in, I've been looking at the numbers and the challenges. It looks like they're just about all more than 85 people, 85 to 100-ish, for weeks now. And it puts up, sometimes has an event where it's 3 of the top 8. Sometimes it's, just in the top 16, 3 or 4 copies, but it continually does well. It's a very, very hard deck to say no to in terms of, just consistency. I have heard a lot of people say they don't want to play it just because of the paper logistics, but I think that that's a pretty bad reason. I think that if you're someone who likes to play control decks and, feels comfortable playing control decks, that you shouldn't really have to think too hard about what it is you're playing. This blue-white deck is very, very good. We've talked about it a couple times on the show here recently. It just has access to such a broad range of answers, and the right mix of card advantage and threats, and it all works. It has so much, and also because of the, in part because of the increased card pool compared to standard we've been used to. The amount of options it has in terms of plans for different problems in the format is so large that, if you look at 2 or 3 different successful blue-white lists, there's not always a lot of consensus about every number or even every sideboard card, or, I would be a bit surprised if it seemed like every blue-white player that I'm looking at, right now, I'm literally scanning through Goldfish to make sure that, people's plans, maybe we see, okay, everyone has, one Hullbreaker Horror, but, the numbers and everything else is completely all over the place, and that says a lot about just the variability of the deck and the reward for getting into it and understanding, how it is you want to play it and how you like to approach the matchups. But it really does have just so much power to it, in being really, really consistent and really leveraging the amount of reactive tools it has.
Yeah, I agree. I think one thing that you also said on the podcast maybe 2 weeks ago now was like, if you look at the formats, all the blue white control decks in every format, or modern and below, I should say, are playing like some number of Emperor, Deluge, and then like even Deduce is popping up a little bit. I saw one copy in a one modern deck. I think that was bad, but like in Pioneer, they're playing 4 Deduce as well, right? Like the deck is like almost identical to its Pioneer counterpart, minus getting some upgrades. And it is just like very powerful. And I do think if you're like someone who likes blue white control, this is like the best blue white control has been in a hot minute. It is very good, and you should not be afraid to tackle it, like Abe said. And it is just a very good deck. I think people typically over-index for control when it comes to like random like people preparing for an event. But this deck is quite good, and like if you know how to play your matchups, this is like all the decks today, I would not be surprised if people succeed with this deck, even if people are targeting it, because it is just so powerful. And it kind of speaks to the format at large, right? Like, we still have a lot more decks to talk about, and some, past episodes of CCA, we would be wrapping up now, or we would have spent more time talking, but there's just so much to go over. So, blue-white is very good, I think, and definitely a deck to, like, keep an eye on and make sure that, like, you have a game plan for.
Like, we've kind of touched on what I'd say are like the big 5 players, which is a big number to say are the big ones. It's like we've got this kind of swath of blue, black, X, mid-range decks that are, leveraging Deep Cavern Bat and black removal spells and counter spells, and then some other number of threats to keep up. Like, those decks are a big portion of the metagame. I think that the blue white and to a lesser extent like Dimir control with like the 3 steps ahead reactive piece of the metagame. We've got the analyst deck, which is kind of its own thing, but is not too dissimilar from like Domain in the sense of it's trying to do the most powerful thing and assemble somewhat of a combo to kill the opponent. In Domain sense, it was like all herd migration plus recruiter in the same turn, and like that'll kill you. And then we've got Convoke, which we haven't really said much about, but Convoke is, I think, the best level 0 of let's play something proactive and fast. Like it just has a really consistent game plan. Has a lot of really powerful stuff. Again, this is a deck that looks like a Pioneer deck because it does play a lot of cards that are in the Pioneer deck. And I think the only thing it really misses from Pioneer is access to kind of the staying power the lands give the Pioneer deck, or gave the Pioneer deck, but Mirix does a decent amount of that. And Inspiring Advantage has made the mana a lot better for the deck as well.
Yeah, like before Inspiring Advantage, right? Like people talk about how like this deck is like so strong, it's just the mana is awful, right? And the other decks got better, but this deck is still good, and people just respect it in the sideboards a lot. But if they don't, they'll lose. And even when they do, sometimes they lose, right? Like, that is how strong Convoke's best draws can be. And if you play it well, I think the deck is very good. I would be very happy to play Convoke at the RC. I think if I had well thought out plans and like was well practiced in the matchups, because I do think people who just show up with like a bunch of wraths and that's all, like those people I think are the ones you beat up on the most, right? There's like people who aren't prepared for you and people who think just like, I'm going to stick 4 pest controls in my deck and that's enough, And it's like, that is not enough to like consistently beat, I think, strong Convoke players. And just things like Nurturing Pixie, picking up Resolute Reinforcements is like one of the things I think has helped a lot. The Knight Errant, like obviously if you get that down is a huge problem. And I think we've seen like Andrew Ellenbogen, I should say, Pro Tour champion. He's been playing the deck some and like has like, main deck Get Lost and, sideboards like Squee and has a bunch of, bigger top-end cards, bigger for them at least, top-end cards in the sideboard. And I think Convoke is just very, very good and really puts your opponent to the test.
Yeah, I mean, it's no surprise that, Ellenbogen, and really like System Magic has been, they've been playing a lot on stream and really ringing the bell of like, hey, Convoke is not as bad as people think it is. And I think that, as more people are moving away from Esper, it only gets better, right? The number of pest controls that go down, because that card is potent against the deck. The more that the deck gets better and better positioned. But, Ellenbogen's Pro Tour win came off the back of playing a Venerated Loxodon white deck with a red splash. Like optimized to win in that format. And while I think in that Pro Tour that he won, it was maybe the second best build for that Pro Tour based on what everyone else had played, but he's right in saying that it's not just as easy as, you know, pack a bunch of lockdowns and pest controls. There are ways that a deck builder can just decide to say, I'm going to beat that. And in doing that, it really will put a lot of players, the RC, to the test, I think, and especially like kind of open book. When you get open deck list of like, what is it my opponent's going to be prepared with, and how is it that I should be positioning myself to beat that? There's a lot of equity there to be had, and it's a deck you have to respect in more ways than just, oh, this is how I'd beat it game one. Like, I pre-boarded for it, this is how I'd beat it, the deck doesn't change anything. Like, that couldn't be further from the truth. The deck has a lot of variability in how it's built and played, so all of that is important. But let's so this is the surface, right? We're going to talk about 5 decks. We're like, okay, this is level 1. This is the start of where things even begin with the format. So let's talk a little bit more about decks from the Pro Tour, and a deck that I talked about in the Always Improving section. I just want to take this time to touch on the Slogurk deck, which I think is kind of a hybridization of kind of like what the what the analyst decks are trying to do in terms of having this kind of inevitable, big combo that it can assemble over time and is a bit difficult to disrupt and has like a lot of grind to it. And, instead of having Memory Deluge, it has Slogurk and the Channel Lands, and like the Inti Rona engine, like all these things that make it pretty resilient, while also having the backup plan of kind of like Esper midrange, and has backup plan of, I'm just going to attack with these creatures that are value creatures, have additional text on them, and power through that. Do you have any like big thoughts on like the Slogurk deck's positioning, or anything to say on that?
I think it's still good. I think it is like a challenging deck to play that like rewards you for putting time in. But I don't think that should be like something to deter somebody. I think personally that's really exciting to me, right? Like, oh, I can put a lot of time into this and I get a lot out of it. I think Slogurk is a deck that people are going to have a lot of weird sort of like wrong assumptions made, because playing versus a bad Slogurk pilot to a good Slogurk pilot to a great pilot is dramatically different. And like some stuff might be working, for you on like Mythic Arena ladder that just is not going to work at the RC. You know what I mean? Like your opponents are just going to play better. They're going to be better at sequencing. They're going to know their roles a lot more. And Slogurk is a deck I think understanding it will help you play against it a lot more. And it's just a deck I like suggest everyone get some time like listening to, like, the people from Sanctum have been like moving around on podcasts. I think Jason has been on like 3 or 4 different podcasts now talking about the deck, and just like listening to the conversations about it is going to help you succeed. So I would actively seek out Gurk content. And this is something I've been saying a lot recently, by the way, Abe, in coaching, is like, if you don't understand a deck, there's a lot of content out there for the deck, probably, right? Like, go and read it, and try to understand it better so that you can play against it. But I think Slogurk is nice, and I think people often really underappreciate how just good, like, NT Rona engine is, but also just, like, NT into Slogurk and start attacking. Like, that can sometimes be a really fast clock. You just crit a land, suddenly your Slogurk's a 5/5. Like, that asks a lot of you immediately.
Yeah, you get Otawara time locked, and you're like, oh, I'm taking 8 this turn now, and they're like, yep, and you're like, yep. It can be a painful existence out there on draws like that. Yeah, I think it's funny thinking that like 5 or 6 years ago, everything you just said, if you subbed out Gurk for Amulet, would be exactly true. Yeah. Except in a different format. And I think the parallel there is like really good to understand. And like, sure, does it make sense for everyone, right? Like even myself, it makes sense for me to take the time to become an Amulet master overnight. It's like, no, I'm not going to be able to do that in a week and a half. Even when I started the process, like even 2.5 weeks was pushing it with my time availability. So, no, not for me. But what I have committed to is, like you said, consuming the content around how the deck works. I know that I think it's actually going to be in like 3 days, probably by the time this episode comes out, it'll be really close. Jason does a lot of writing on its website, like about Magic, like pretty much weekly. And it has an article about the Gurk deck on like at the PT, and like a breakdown of like how it's approaching the matchup, what are important things to know about it, and that goes free, I think, like 30 days after originally posting, or you can pay $5 on Patreon to get access to it early. So I paid $5. I was like, okay, I'm going to spend the time playing it. And even though I'm not going to spend any more time playing Slogurk before the event, I do feel like I really understand that deck a lot better in terms of what is possible with it. And that's even before taking the time, which I know I will, to watch some gameplay of it. To see it go through the motions from the player side, go back and watch coverage matches of it, like really understand what the punishes that it has that might not be obvious on the surface level are, and I think that that's really, really important to consider and keep in mind. I also think it's important, just as like one more, just going to tie back to what we're saying about Analyst and Blue-White, is that I think that the Legends deck is similar in that because it's trying to execute its game plan first and foremost across so many matchups, and it doesn't need different cards to do that, it just needs to play them a bit differently. It's in that same class of deck that is very well positioned to play against a lot of things. It's one of the decks that doesn't have to think about what it needs to do, or like make its card, like doesn't have cards that are not going to work for it in multiple places. And so as long as it's doing its thing, it's pretty well equipped. Which does, I think put it in that tier of, if not for the complexity curve issue of like how many people are really going to have in 1 month become proficient enough to really understand the ins and outs of the deck, and feel comfortable enough to take that risk on their RC, their one shot for the PT for this quarter. Like people who don't feel confident doing that, like how prevalent will it be? But I do think it's like in terms of power level, in the right hands, absolutely up there. And I wanted to make sure that was clear. I think that just because it might even, now that more people understand how to play against it, maybe it does worse there too. But that brings it down from okay, it put like what five people in the top 32, like most of them in the top 16, including 2 in the top 8 of the Pro Tour, to okay, it's just one of the best decks, and you should know how to handle it or what your plan is against it, or else. Yep. Like it might be a step down, but it's a step down from 1 or 2 to 2 or 3. So
yeah, I think Gurk is very good. I echo what you said. I think it's very, very strong, and I think you should be 100% thinking about it. I do want to also say that like Gurk reminds me of not only Amulet, but also Lantern. And I can see it now, Abe, in 5 years, the Ristic study video on the Overslime. Like, he dropped his video about Lantern. I watched it yesterday at the airport, and I was like, dang, there's going to be a Slurgurk video in 5 years. Maybe less. But I think that this deck is just, very weird and plays Magic in, a totally new way a lot of the time. And I think, that's just a really cool thing, and it's a dope deck. I do want to talk a bit about, there's some other decks that we want to cover here and the kind of the next level of things. And I think we talked a bit about it earlier, and we talked about it last time we talked about Sam. That's the black-green mid-range deck. This was a deck that I really like. I think it is solid and underappreciated by players, but I do not think it is it is the deck that earlier in the podcast, I kind of mentioned maybe there's 1 or 2 decks that we're going to talk about today that some people might really push back. And this is probably that one where I think you need to have a good build of the deck that is correctly tuned for the weekend, more so than normal mid-range decks. But if you do, I think your deck will succeed. I think there is some raw power to the deck that isn't just classic mid-range, grindy BS.
Yeah, I think that there's a few things that have really been leaned into by the green-black deck. It started to put up some really, really major results on Magic Online in this last week. And some of those innovations, I think, are primarily leaning into Kervek, as well as the easy ways to generate committing a crime triggers for some people are playing 4 free starter lookouts. I was just playing a list with Broncos and less of the crime stuff, but there are other engines you can have in black to generate card advantage. But specifically using Kervek and Graveyard Trespasser to commit a crime, or free starter lookout and Trespasser to commit a crime, or Hearst to commit a crime, or some of these lists are even playing Cease and Desist, which is one of the hybrid cards from Murders of Karlov Manor that can exile some cards from a graveyard and draw a card for 2. and that also commits a crime. All of these things are like, turning the removal spells into +1s, or even, doing sometimes more than that, depending on the build. I think also Hostile Investigator becoming a more and more relevant card in the format. Like a lot of the black mid-range decks are picking up on that card, which at its face is just like 4/3 Ravenous Rats that makes a clue when they discard. But there's a lot of things that make discarding really valuable in the format, and like a lot of ways to discard things to get, like, you channel a channel land, that's triggering the Hostile Investigator, and that's giving your opponent a clue. And those things really do add up, especially in the mid-range matches, or like you trigger Connive off of Ravine and you're giving your opponent a clue. These are all like, pretty common play patterns that it takes advantage of, and the body's pretty strong too. So there's just a lot of like interesting things happening in the mid-range space. And I think the black-green mid-range deck, especially by way of wanting to play things that interact with the graveyard, like those graveyard interactions line up naturally well against like Temur Analyst. Being able to play the amount of removal they do lines up well against the other mid-range decks. Having access to a lot of small, or like not small, but like cheap ground creatures is pretty good against Convoke. And still having access to all the sweepers they do, even if not pest control, which might be like the best one against some of the Convoke decks. It still has access to like a bunch of Path of Perils and other kinds of answers. So this is something that's really like taken shape. I know I've seen builds that range from doing some of the slower crime stuff with Free Strider Lookout and Karavek, to ones that are playing like the Turtle from Eldraine that gets a land back from your, like, mills you 3 and gets a land back from the graveyard, and then does that when it attacks as well, and kind of builds this mass of creature lands that is really good against the blue-white decks and the blue-black decks, like the hard control decks, in terms of the way it generates value. So there's a lot of just good stuff that the mid-range interaction is doing, kind of in the same way that for a while in Pioneer, like Graveyard Trespasser, like when people were like, why is this card good? And it's like, well, slowing down a Treasure Cruise or picking off a Memory Deluge or an Arclight Phoenix, those are all good things to be doing, and the card's hard to kill. Like, a lot of those same factors, although not in the same card names, are present in the current standard format. And I think the mid-range decks, like Golgari mid-range especially, has just been kind of really cool proof of that, and seeing all the variations in that show that there's still a lot to be done there. And I think that as far as decks that have cropped up since the Pro Tour, you might not have heard about if you haven't really been able to follow events. I know that the Dimir control deck was kind of a Canadian RC breakout deck, with like the Devious cover-ups and 3 steps ahead, so some people might know about that. But I think Golgari mid-range is kind of since that event, the biggest breakout that I'd say. I don't know if you'd agree with that, Mason.
No, I totally agree. I think that's a great way to put it. And I really like what you said on that. I don't want to pivot too far away unless you have more you want to say about black-green, but I think talking about blue-black might be good too, because we talked about blue-white some, but it is different, and I think it is sort of this next level type thing here. So, like, why would I want to be playing these black cards, Abe, instead of, like, the Wandering Emperor and No More Lies? Like, what makes you want to get away from those cards? Because those are incredibly attractive cards.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, pretty simply put, the upside to playing black is that the discard spells are good. The removal, the 1/1 removal is a bit better, and also Deadly Cover-Up is very, very, very strong in this format, because a lot of the decks are just playing 4 of the best things, and even a lot of the best decks are reliant on some key piece of their deck working. And as a control deck, the ability to not only be casting an efficient enough sweeper, like a 5-mana sweeper is good enough to see play, but the fact that it's also one that when you collect evidence on it can remove a problem from the rest of the game for you is really, really potent. Like, I played a good amount of the blue-black control deck in testing for this RC, and sometimes, like, in control mirrors, I would, like, find a way to get a Wandering Emperor off the board, and then, like, we'd be playing land go for a while, and when I was getting close to letting the shields down, or, like, I knew I had the mana to fight over something, or I knew they wanted to deluge, like, okay, yeah, let me just cover up and collect evidence on no board, and let's see how you like that. Because if I take away these Wandering Emperors, like, you're kind of going to have to fight over these Field of Ruins and stuff, and that's going to be a harder game for you to win than what my deck's built to do. And like sometimes you just catch them, and that's just really strong. So not only from matchups where like you want your sweeper because it's a sweeper, like in mid-range decks, that's pretty cool too, to be able to say, okay, no more Shieldreds for you. We're going to make you have to have threats you need to commit, or no more Mosswood Dread Knights, or no more Rafines or Bats, whatever it is that's a problem for you. As the control deck, you can kind of seal that away. But even just the ability to say, okay, let's remove this from you, especially in a deck that primarily wins from milling out the opponent with Jace or with creature lands, that is a really, really strong effect. And I think that as far as why to play this deck, that would be why. Like that card alone and its positioning in the format currently, like if you can get all the World Souls Rages out of your analyst opponent's deck, they have a pretty hard time winning, Mason. Like that is their primary kill condition, is to fireball you. So, or buy it back with Shigeki, or do all these things to try to make sure it can completely grind you out. But it's not easy when those things are removed from your deck to win, and those are a lot of wins you can get for quote unquote free by playing this deck that make it a lot easier than it might seem to kind of win the old-fashioned way with attrition like that.
Yeah, I agree. No, I don't have much to add. I do think Deadly Cover-Up is very good. And when your opponent, like you said, right, like if your deck is built around doing a thing and I remove the thing, that is really good. And this is why we see players like sometimes get drawn to cards like Surgical Extractions or Necromentia, like these kind of cards, right, in other formats. Because if you do remove something from somebody, that can sometimes be game ending. The problem is, right, is they're typically not worth a card on their own, right? Like unless your opponent is solely in on one thing. And even a lot of these decks we're talking about do have other ways that could grind you. But the fact this is attached to kind of like a 5-mana sweeper or something that, that is the going rate for sweepers in Standard. And it's like, yeah, if I play a blue-black control deck, I would play 5-mana, kill all the creatures in some number. And the fact it doubles is almost a win condition for me. Or even like sort of this counterspell-esque thing of just removing this option for you becomes a huge, huge part of the deck. So I really like it. I think it is a reasonable choice. It is hard to take the Wandering Emperor from me because I think she is so strong, but I can totally see it as an option.
And correct me if I'm wrong, I think there are some people who agree with you on, like, don't take the Wandering Emperor from me, as there are, like, builds of Esper Control which are playing, like, Deadly Cover-Ups and also just splashing white, making their mana worse to play the Wandering Emperor and No More Lies, right? Like, those cards are that good, and they're willing to say, okay, I'll just have my mana be noticeably worse, have a few more tap lands between, like, Rafine's Towers, and then hopefully, I don't need to cast the Wandering Emperor on 4 every game, or like No More Lies on 2. These cards are good enough for me to use them as needed, but it is notable that people are doing that. It's even won a challenge like in the last week or two. So,
yeah, no, I mean the Wandering Emperor card is very, very good, and doing this kind of like take away all your threats and then also add in like a real win condition to the deck, it's a very nice place to be. I don't know if the mana is worth the squeeze, but I think it is worth looking at. Is sort of my take for the podcast on that. And speaking of worth taking a look at, Abe, there's one deck we kind of talked about its sort of brother, when it comes to things, a very similar deck. We didn't hop into it, and that's the Toxic/Infect deck. That deck is very similar to Convoke in that it's kind of like a go wide, low to the ground creature deck. Plays differently and has a lot of different aspects to it, including some of the worst mana you've ever seen. But let's talk about that deck a little bit, because it has cropped up a little bit. It was doing kind of well, and it does have some really strong matchups, right? Like, against Domain, you're such a huge favorite. And decks like Analyst, for example, the life gain from the lands don't matter, right? Like, the Toxic doesn't go away.
Yeah, I think, like, and kind of we've touched on this a little bit in terms of talking about some of these decks on, if we talk about the big five, is that a lot of the rest of the decks in the format we're talking about are all very playable. Like, what do they call them in this is why I wish Spencer was here, is what did they call them in Smash Ultimate when it was like Omega fight? No, Omega's the stages, where you had a fighter that was like a reskin but had different movesets.
Oh, I know what you're talking about. Yeah, they're like a shadow. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's the same kind of build in terms of like what it's kind of doing structurally, but it has a different way of going about it in a subtle way that does make a difference. So yeah, the Echo fighters of some of those some of the other decks that are in the top echelons, like Bant is probably the closest comparable Echo fighter to Boros Convoke, and like, you know, blue black is kind of the Echo fighter blue white. There's a deck or two that are like kind of that way to Domain. I digress. But Poison, it has I think like a really, really strong matchup spread against everything except for maybe just Convoke. I think also the green black decks might be tough, but like Convoke definitely outdoes it in terms of being on the board, because a lot of the way that like you think Bant Poison, I think the first time the Poison deck really started doing well was around this time last year for San Diego. There was the Japanese RC where Selesnya Toxic took that tournament by storm. The Bant Toxic deck is a pretty big departure from that. It's been this way for a long while, like since standard RSQ season. This is one of the things that popped up as really a way to beat Domain, and stuck with that. But the goal is to just get a poison counter or two on early, as many as you can really on early. And then it plays a ton of things that proliferate to kind of get there, as well as, you know, just leverage Skrelv's Hive and going wide around putting out blockers to get the poison it needs. So like Serum Snare, it has a ton of like bounce spells, like it has Fading Hope, it has March of Swirling Mist, which kind of does double time with Venerated Rot Priest. It's a bit of a Splinter Twin situation. Just target all of your stuff and put poison counters on your opponent, or get a bunch of blockers out of the way, or both, to just kind of force through all of its little 1/1 toxic creatures. And like that game plan is very, very difficult, especially when backed up by soft counter magic like Spell Pierce or Bring the End. And like I said, like bounce spells like Serum Snare, which can also proliferate, and, you know, getting a token every turn from Skrelv's Hive, and playing so well with its lands, like having the Seed Core and Mirrex, and also benefiting from Botanical Sanctum joining the fray from Outlaws Thunder Junction. Like, this deck has gotten some upgrades, but the mana is probably the biggest. The mana is probably the biggest downside, in addition to not having a good way to deal with decks that are playing 1-drops on turn 1. And especially ones that want to block. Like mono red, you can still get around pretty easily, because Phoenix Chick isn't the best at blocking, and you have like a lot of your stuff works in that matchup. But, you know, I'd say that Poison has a lot of powerful enough draws to overcome some bad matchups, and its good matchups are really, really good. Like you said, beginning around all the lanes in a life gain, kind of playing a different game, and also being as like disruptive as it is against decks that need to close quickly against it, all adds up in the deck's favor. And a lot of matchups that I think are pretty relevant for this tournament.
Well, Abe, we have talked about so many decks. Is there anything else you want to talk about today before we wrap things up?
I do want to say that, so I said there was like a couple Echo Fighters. The last Echo Fighter I can really think of, but I think it's just a sweet deck. I don't know if Spencer talked about it on the show last week or not. I don't remember.
I think it was
how much we got into it. Okay, yeah, we're talking about it in the Patreon Discord. That makes sense. But there's like a Gruul ramp deck that I think is really sweet. That's kind of doing the Domain thing, and like it's gonna like get a bunch of mana and then like kill you in one turn using Smuggler's Surprise and Terror of the Peaks and Calamity to copy the Terror of the Peaks and like 30 your opponent in the same turn. And I think that's just things like that when you're preparing for this event and thinking about like what deck you're choosing and why and how it stacks up in the format, think about it in terms of what are the really good versions of your decks. Like what are the conventionally, like this is the best version of the deck that you're playing doing, right? If you do choose one of these kind of alternate skins of what's the conventionally strongest way to go about it, understand the matchup spread that you're thinking about that makes it so that is why you want to do it. Like, where is it you're getting your edge? Because there are a lot of ways to do it. And also, you know, don't be afraid to look kind of, right, peek off of and get inspiration from, you know, other players' paper in terms of like, you know, what is it that the poison decks are doing to try to get around what's going on? Or if you're playing Convoke or vice versa, or what is it that, you know, some of the blue-black mid-range decks are trying to do if you're trying to build Golgari, or what are some of the control decks doing, or analyst decks doing to beat some of these problems that are going to crop up in the last, week or so before the RC. And I think there's a lot to be gleaned from that. And I think it's the most wide open and diverse standard format in terms of gameplay that there's been in a long time. I mean, I felt that standard's been good for a very long time, like since it was bad, since we got out of the kind of like Theros Beyond Death era, and banned a lot of stuff that was pretty problematic from Eldraine and beyond, and got rid of Uro. Like, the format's been in a bunch of really good places, and I'm really glad we're back to playing it, because I think people are really feeling that. Like, even at RCQs I'm going to for Pioneer Mason, I'm sure you've had this experience talking to people in coaching, or maybe even when you're in the streets yourself, where people are just like, I'm just excited to get back into playing Standard when I'm done with this event, or done preparing for this event. It's like, this is what I want to be doing. This is the format where the game's the most fun, and I can do what I want to do, some of the most. And there's a lot of room to explore and try ideas. And I think that's just really awesome. I think this RC, and every RC, is going to, like, really, for this format at least, is going to be a really exciting one to see what the results from them are. And it really feels like, I don't know, it feels like in heyday, like GP Magic, where it's like, every other week or so there's a new event that has, really high stakes to people, and we're seeing something new and watching the storylines the tournament develop. So I'm just really excited for it.
Yeah, it's going to be super cool to see how it all plays out. Like we said, it's 11 days from now. I'm not playing, I am commentating it, so I'll start off here first, so that way you can listen to Abe more thoroughly, but I would play Analyst. At least as of right now, maybe things change over 8-9 days, whatever that happens with RCs. But as of right now, I think Analyst is very, very strong. I think it is like the best at trying to assemble its game plan and do it while also pivoting for what the people are trying to stop it with. I am not that scared of Rest in Peace. Like, it is good, but it is not the end of the world. You can bring cards to beat it. I think Atrax's Fall is like a really clean card that answers, Rest in Peace, and answers other cards that are problematic from decks that are playing Rest in Peace. So I think it is good. I do not think that, like, I'm worried about time is a real thing. If you're thinking about playing blue-white, I don't think that, like, the mechanics is a real thing. I think you should really just try to, like, practice those, and you should be fine. I think the Analyst deck is very good. I think there are lots of other good decks that you could choose, but Analyst is my pick. Abe, what about you?
Yeah, so I'm currently in the process of crossing a bunch of things off my list before I decide to play Analyst. Like, basically, my process is to pretend that Analyst does not exist as a deck for me to play, because if I start playing it, I'm not going to want to stop playing it, because I think it is really, like, I have been very impressed by it, watching it and playing it some myself. You even at one point had turned me on to playing a Pioneer version of it that was so fun that I was like, okay, I want to play the Standard deck now too. But, like, I think that Analyst is so good and such a good fallback, regardless of where I think the metagame's at, that unless I find something I'm really feeling confident in that's one of these other decks, and even then after saying, okay, this is maybe my front runner, now let me play Analyst and see if Analyst feels better than this deck or not. That's kind of my process, and that's where I am in it. I've got some friends who I'm also working with, and a lot of them are talking about, Esper being choices they're liking, especially ones who are, like you're saying. I agree, like, I wouldn't be that concerned, especially for a player who feels confident in navigating some of these control mirrors from a high level, worried about playing control mirrors. And going to time and things like that. Like, I think that those can be overcome, and you should really not let that be the reason that you'd be kicking yourself at the end of the day for not doing it, right? That's the outcome I would really want to make sure you're remembering if you're saying, I don't want to play this because I'm worried about going to time, is like, okay, at the end of the tournament, if you miss day 2, or you have, like, you squeak into day 2 and have a mediocre performance and miss cash, like, are you going to feel regret about not playing blue-white because you really wanted to play blue-white, but everyone said, oh, well, what if you play against slow people and it goes to time? It's like, that you can't think like that and try to win. But I think there's just so many decks that are playable, and it's so hard to narrow it down to just one choice this far out. But I think Analyst is the most powerful and, like, most powerful proactive thing you can do, with the most flexible cards in it, and in general, like, generates the most powerful mana advantage in most of its game the quickest. So, kind of draw a parallel to an old standard. It's like playing Team or Wreck compared to playing Blue-White Control in that format. And as time showed, Team or Wreck was the deck to play. And I think that in similar fashion, the ability to just like untap on turn 4 or 5 with twice as much mana as your opponent and, you know, start flashing back Deluges and finding everything you need, and your deck being smaller and having so many good pivots available to you, and such good mana and extra life points, it's like hard to say no to all that, you know. Like, there's a lot of good reasons. So yeah, that's where I'm at in my process, is cross it off than that.
Anyways, with that being said, that was the main topic for today's episode. Once again, if you want to support the show, go to patreon.com/ccmtg. Let you ask a question on the show, like right now, except we don't have any patron questions. The patrons have dried up a little bit, and I think that makes a little bit of sense. You know, there's a lot of discussion in the Discord about like standard and decklist stuff. I think a lot of people are kind of in the MH3 waiting room, right? Like, we're kind of just in a weird waiting period right now, and a lot of people are also keeping stuff tight to the chest due to the RC when it comes to like content and other stuff. So go out there, you know, ask us questions. We'll answer them. You can find the show on Twitter at ccmtg. You can find us on YouTube. Once again, constructive criticism on YouTube. You can see the show in its video form. You can leave comments and stuff like that. It's a great way to support the show for free. And Abe, if someone wants to find you, where can they go?
People can find me over at twitter.com/morenothings. DMs are open for coaching, although I'm not booking until times in mid to late June. And yeah, I don't know. That's just about it for me. How about you, Mason?
You can find me over on Twitter at Mason E. Clark. Abe, we are on the final 12 hours until MH3. I can finally really start talking about stuff. If you want to follow me on social media, I've posted a couple little TikTok videos. I've got some cool things planned. I'm excited to talk all about that. It's been my personality for a couple weeks. But yeah, you can check me out there. You can find me on Twitch at twitch.tv/TheMasonClark. I've been streaming more. Daybreak put me in the creator program, which I'm very thankful for. And just trying to stream while I have this kind of God account and just do more of the like weirder things that people don't engage with as much and just kind of have fun and vibe. And my stream was very vibe first, magic second. So if you want to come hang out, you know, we're going to have a good time and be chit-chatting and also maybe playing some wild decks and trying to, you know, get a 5-0 and ruin someone's weekend when they play my deck that they probably shouldn't play. So you can check me out there at twitch.tv/MasonClark. And if you want to get coaching, you can reach out on Twitter at Mason E. Clark or via email, masoneclark@gmail.com. Put coach in the description, that way I know it's you. And check out my articles on TCG Player every other week. Abe, I am writing all about Modern Horizon 3 spoilers. And I'm going to give you an inside scoop thing. So I can only obviously write about cards that are previewed. But I have a good idea of what might be previewed early on. And I got my own preview card. So I wrote about my own preview card. And I wrote a bunch of like skeleton blurbs on the airplane. So that, like, basically no matter what mythics get previewed at the beginning of tomorrow's stream, I can just, like, round it out and be done with my article in, like, an hour.
I can't wait until until the preview season is over and you can start debuting, like, and if this mythic was previewed, it was going to be this. And if this mythic was previewed, it was going to be this.
Well, the real secret is I got the next article, you know. No, but it's going to be very exciting. I can't wait to see sort of what cards everyone gets to see and their talk about everything. It's, very exciting. We got a little bit of a taste of that, unfortunately, I would say, thanks to some leaks. But, it's going to be cool to see what it's like in full motion tomorrow. And also, I think there's going to be a very cool video that Michael Majors and Carmen Clomperens, I believe, did. I saw she tweeted about doing it. I believe Majors retweeted it, so maybe he's not actually in it. But they were two of the people who worked on the set a bunch. That video is going to be, I think, very telling. Just because they did these kind of videos in the past, with like All Be One, and they had the set lead and sort of the designers talk about it. And I think that will like help give people an idea of what the set's going for as like the previews start rolling out. So if you like that, or you like general Magic design stuff, check out those videos. They should be up by the time of this recording by a day or two. You just go to the Magic YouTube channel. And Abe, it's time for What Did We Learn This Week? What did you learn this week?
Mason, there's so much going on in Standard, but I learned that you are through and through just tried and true locked on analyst. Like, I'm surprised that you're not more in, I guess probably, like, I understand perspective of doing commentary and not being like in the nitty gritty thick of it, but I'm surprised that even from that perspective, probably playing as many decks as you have, you still feel that way about analyst. That's like pretty eye opening to me.
Yeah, I think analyst is really good. I mean, I think, Abe, if we were preparing for this event, I would be telling you to be playing, like, stop dilly-dallying and help me figure out the analyst plans. You know what I mean? I would be like, you have one more day, and then let's get to talking about sideboarding, because there's so much we can do, and the deck is so good. And, you know, I think there will be a decent amount of people that rightfully so, target the deck with a lot of hate. I think it's beatable. I'm not, 1,000% willing to bet my life on it, but I think the deck is really, really good. And it's also just the kind of deck I like to play. You mentioned in the show, right, like how it's a big picture, sort of like play your game plan macro style deck. And those are the kind of decks I definitely gravitate to the most. Not always, but the most. So there's definitely a lot of it to me. I will say this, as kind of in a similar vein, actually, I was very impressed with how much work you've done with how little time you've had on all the decks. Like, I knew that you were very pressed with time. I knew you were preparing, but I was expecting maybe needed to come in a bit more, and you really had like a great understanding, I think, of all the decks, and you were able to compact it to the viewers in very tight packages, which I think just led to me not talking a lot, which was fine, because I think you nailed it. And so, regardless, I think, you can be proud of, like, you've put in a lot of good work going into the RC, and now it's just a matter of playing the games, I think. So
Mason, you ever play an SCG Open during finals week?
No, Abe, I'm a little older than you.
I was born in it. I was molded by it.
Oh my goodness, man! I miss the SCG days. I was talking to some people this past week. I mean, we talked about earlier about Scrap Babies, but Steve Stillman, we were talking about some of the old SCG stuff, and we were talking about like the Pittsburgh Hogak first Modern Horizons Open, and it was just a good time. To talk about all that sort of stuff. So, anyways, thank you all so much for listening to this week's episode of Constructed Criticism. We're going to be back next week talking about a pretty excited big picture level up, so don't miss it. We'll see you then.